Hello, we will look at this pending topic on FTP. As you're well aware, FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol, and the name itself tells you this is basically to transfer files from one system to another. Now you need to understand that FTP is basically works on the underlying TCP/IP stack, so it's more important on the reliability aspect of transferring files. It actually works on TCP underlying transport protocol. So basically, there are some challenges that needs to be dealt when you actually transfer files, copy files from one host to another. Some challenges, if you basically see, are when you basically transfer files from one system to another, they may have a different way to represent data. That is one aspect that is there. They might have a different directory structures, which again you need to solve that problem there, and they may have different file naming conventions, which again you might need to resolve. So all these challenges are being actually dealt with in FTP, where it actually solves the problem, and it is also enable you to transfer very large files, which is using different formats ultimately in the different systems from one host to another host. So we'll get on to the actual model of how an FTP basically works. So it's again a client server model, and there is going to be some command send and you get a response to that. So that's how basically application layer works. So if you basically see at the client side, there are basically three components that are involved in the client side and two components that are involved in the server side. So three components, if you basically see, are the user interface, where the user actually enters the command. But there are two processes that are involved here. One is called the control process, and the other is basically called as the data transfer process. So you need to understand that there is basically two kinds of connection getting established here. Separately, for the control process, you have a control connection being established. We'll come to know why there are basically two connections. And for the data communication to happen, which means the transferring files, you need a separate connection that is there. That's basically called as the data connection. So this is the file system that you have, which ultimately might be in different formats, in which it's basically dealing with the files. The separation of the commands, the connection that is being there, makes FTP quite efficient. The first point here is control connection here is basically involves some simple rules to transfer, say, some commands, and you get a response. So it's just a line of command that you send, and you get a response. Whereas in the data connection, there are some complex rules that are there, because it depends on the variety of the data transfer that you're basically doing, the data types that are involved, and hence data connection is being handled separately there. But yeah, always you need to start up the connection, for which you basically need the control connection to be set up, and then during the data transfer you need a data connection being opened and closed for every file transfer activity that is being done. So there is basically the lifetime that is involved based on these two connections. So the control connection basically has different quite a different lifetime compared to that of data connection. So basically, if you see, the control connections remains connected during the entire session, FTP session that you're dealing with. So once you start an FTP session, you basically try to establish a connection, and it keeps connected throughout your entire duration of the session. Now in between, in the data connection that you want to transfer, every file transfer activities, maybe you might be transferring several files, or there are several records within the files. So what basically happens is data connection is opened and closed for every transfer activity. So the lifetime of the data connection is different when compared to that of the control connection that you basically see, right? So getting on to this, there are several commands that are basically dealt with. And prior to that, I want to tell you that since there are two connections involved, there are two well-known port numbers in which basically the FTP server process is running. One is the port number 21. Now this is basically for the control connection, a well-known port number, and the port number 20 is basically used for the server data connection, right? So this is allocated for the server process for the two different connections, and you know that the client level, it's an ephemeral port number which actually is being established based on the request that is there. Okay, so we have to get into the commands that are basically being used. So some commands are only listed here. Basically you need to do an authentication. So the commands, maybe you send the username and it asks for the authenticated password, and you go on to send the password followed by this command, and if it's authenticated properly, then you go on to get the access. As usual, you have to know that it's basically directories and files. You might either go on to store your files from the client to the server, right, or you might retrieve the files from the server to the client. So there are commands like retrieve, which is basically from retrieving file from the server to the client, or the storing the files from the client to the server, right? So ultimately you might need to list out the directories that are there, get into that directory, change to that particular directory. So you have commands for that. You have cwd command to change to that particular directory. You have pwd command similar to the Linux, where you basically see the present working directory. You have the list, which is similar to the ls command, which is basically for listing the files that are there in the directory, and accordingly you make a decision of what to store, what to retrieve, right, where to store and all that. Right, so this is that is there, but yeah, unless or until you're authenticated, you are not entitled to do all this. And as you saw in HTTP, there are status code for every command that is being passed in, whether the password is username is okay, or the data connection is open, or there are some problems related to that. 4xx series deals with problems. So similarly like that, you have for the FTP, which you really don't need to mug up things, but yeah, just come to know as the similar case that you have a 3-digit status code which tells you the response of the command that you're basically issued. Okay, so let's basically see an example here where you're trying to actually retrieve a file. So there's basically just one file to be transferred, but I just want to tell you certain things on the type of the files and all that. A file can be of several types. It can be an ASCII format, or it can be EBCDIC format, extended binary coded decimal interchange code, or it can be an image. So there are several file types that are being defined, and accordingly you might need to use the code to differentiate that file type. And you might also need to understand that there are different ways in which you organize the structure of the file. There is something called as a F type, which stands for file type. There is file type is a default one, which literally tells you that the structure of the file is there is no structure being assigned to that file. It is just a stream of bytes that you try to flow, and that is specified by the keyword F. There is another thing called R. R stands for record, meaning your file is actually split up as records. Now imagine that you have a text file and you're trying to split that as several records, and you're transferring these records. So there is something called as an R type, file type. There's one more thing that is basically called as the page. Page stands for P. This is one of the file type where you actually split up into several pages, and every page basically has a header, footer and all that. So how many number of pages you basically need to deal with, that many you go on to actually do that. In this case, you basically are transferring that in 6 sections, and you're basically using this R record format. So everything is basically a record, and you go on to have that transfer being done. Yeah. So let's basically see a sequence of flow of commands that basically starts with. So you need to understand that there is a control connection being established, and then you go on to have the sequence of the data connection, followed by the series of the data transfer. Once that is done, and the server goes on to say, now suppose you're trying to retrieve files from the server to the client. once the server sends all the thing, he can go on to issue indirect way that it's done, and you go on to actually close your control connection. Till that, you basically can have for every file transfer activity a separate data connection being established. So if you basically see, it all starts with telling the server is telling that its service ready, and then followed by a sequence of commands sent by the server to authenticate itself for the user. There is a status code sent, it's saying username is okay, and then ask for the password. You want to send your password, and there is a success status code coming in, and then you go on to set up your ephemeral port number. And you need to know that for the control connection, it's been set up, followed by the data connection that basically starts with. So that's the port number for the data connection, for which he goes on to send a status code, and then you go on to say that the type of the file is EBCDIC format, which says okay for that. And then what you're trying to do here is you're trying to use this command called the structure of the file, which is stru, and the R states it's in the record format. Right, so you're going to send several records of your file. So ultimately he says okay for that, and then you're trying to retrieve by going on to specify the entire path in the server. And this is a file that you basically want to retrieve. And so what happens is the data connection is open, and he goes on to retrieve this. He goes on to send the several sets of records in a series of transfer that basically done. And once that is done, this guy goes on to close the data connection. So for one pair that you basically have for the file, there's a data connection being established, and then once everything is, the client has no more request to send, he can go on to send a quit command, and the service basically closes. So this is basically the way in which the FTP works, and that would end the session on FTP. So thanks.